President Joe Biden published an op-ed in the Washington Post last week proposing some reforms to the Supreme Court as well as a constitutional amendment to limit presidential power after the Supreme Court's decision on giving immunity to Donald Trump. So this is super interesting. It kind of perked my ears up when I saw it because it's an op-ed published by the president, which is not a super common thing.
It's not common.
We have definitely talked about court reform before, and we're in favor for it. I know you are one of the people that I know who bangs the table the hardest that the court is political and that its power should be limited.
Yeah.
So let's get into his specific reforms.
Sure.
He proposes 18-year term limits, and since there are 9 justices on the court, that means the president would be able to appoint a new justice every 2 years on a regular schedule rather than kind of the random and arbitrary appointments that happen just when justices decide to step down or if they die.
Yes, they're trying to remove the randomness and the stakes that each presidential election has over control of the courts.
Yes.
An example of this is Donald Trump was elected to 1 4-year term, and he got 3 Supreme Court appointments. Joe Biden was elected to 1 4-year term, and he only got 1.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a failure of the system to adequately represent the people's ideology being replicated in the judiciary.
For sure. Yeah. And since the idea was it wouldn't matter as much because the justices are supposed to be nonpartisan figures
Right.
who in their appointment won't necessarily dictate how the cases are determined. But when you look at the data of cases, at least over the past 50 years, conservatives have controlled the court basically over that whole time. And many really important decisions that they've made have skewed in the conservative direction.
For sure.
So that has really had an effect on the direction of law enforcement in this country. So 18-year term limits is one thing that he proposed. The other thing that he proposed is a binding ethics code. And this really comes out of what we talked about articles of impeachment raised by AOC.
That's right.
Last week or 2 weeks ago when we recorded the show for Justices Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito.
Yes.
Because of ethical violations that they had made. But right now the court has an ethics code, but it's self-enforcing.
Yeah, it's self-enforcing.
Which means there's no power to it.
There's no body that oversees it and makes sure that they are accurately providing over that ethics code. No one is checking them. And so what this is calling for is saying that the lower courts can act as a check on the Supreme Court, and the lower courts can review certain behaviors and be sure that all of the ethics codes in this enforceable ethics code that will be written up are then going to be enforceable. Now, this has been something that has also been pushed for by Dick Durbin, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. This is like bottom of the barrel, most obvious, simplest reform that should be done. Crazy that it hasn't been done before. This is the most should be the most non-controversial piece of this whole plan.
Yeah.
And then the third piece is trying to pass a constitutional amendment to limit the presidential immunity. So Congress recently approved, the Supreme Court recently ruled in favor of Donald Trump in his immunity case, saying that he is immune for all official acts, criminally immune for all official acts he took as president. This also made him immune of any official acts that he took as president to be used as evidence against any crime he may have committed in office, even if the crime wasn't an official act. You can't use official acts as evidence of those crimes. So this basically makes the president totally immune to anything that he chooses to do criminally after leaving office.
Yeah.
He is not personally accountable to any actions he takes. Joe Biden has said this is ridiculous, and he knows the only way to get around a Supreme Court decision that is interpreting the Constitution is to change the Constitution. It's a heavy lift, obviously. What you need to do is you need to get, I think it's
It's 2/3.
2/3, and then 75% of states to then say, okay, good to go.
Yeah. It's dead on arrival.
It's dead on arrival. There's no way for it to happen. The term limits is another thing that's up in the air. The legal scholarship is kind of divided, but more so in favor of one way. They say that the only way to get term limits is through a constitutional amendment, specifically because of the good behavior clause in Article 3, which says that Supreme Court justices shall hold their offices during good behavior. And in the 80s and in the early 2000s, by both liberal and conservative justices alike, this means that they have interpreted this meaning as justices will have lifetime appointments unless they resign, retire, or are removed through impeachment.
Yeah.
So term limits are going to be a heavy lift, but I really have to commend President Biden on coming out with something like this, because he is now the first president since FDR to propose any amendments, any change to the status quo of the judicial system.
Yeah.
Compared to FDR, Joe Biden's proposal is nothing. Moderate.
Yeah.
Weak is the way that I would probably put it in comparison to FDR's. FDR wanted to, for every justice that was over the age of 70 throughout the entire judicial branch, he wanted to appoint an additional justice. So if the justice were to retire, then he wouldn't appoint anybody. But if the justice didn't retire, he would dilute that old justice's power by appointing a younger person onto the court.
Okay. But you say you still commend Biden because even though it would be weak compared to FDR, it's not now.
Way better. It's way better than what we have right now.
For sure.
Biden's decision on this term limit thing is probably exactly what I would have done.
Yeah.
I have been proponent of regular appointments of Supreme Court justices since I've started caring about this issue. There has been so many legal scholars that have endorsed a plan just like this.
Yeah.
And I think he is what Joe Biden does best is he culminates the opinions of all the experts around him, and he does that thing.
Yeah.
That is what Joe Biden does.
Yeah, and that's why he's an amazing president.
That's why he's a very good president.
And so because I would argue, and I think you would agree, that all of these proposed reforms are dead on arrival. They will not happen. They require far too much congressional support, and that even though they are supported by the experts in the field, we're not governed by the experts in the field. We're governed by partisans. So I feel like the thing to point out what this does is shift the Overton window.
Absolutely.
And it really normalizes the idea of court reform. We've already seen it starting with kind of the actions of far left people like AOC to attack the court. People might argue that those attacks are unconstitutional. I think we would argue, or not unconstitutional, but just
unwarranted.
Yeah, like
bad taste.
Attacks on the institutions.
Sure.
I think we would argue they're trying to uphold the integrity of those institutions.
That's a great way to frame it. I would do these. That's a great way to frame it.
Yeah, but they have been relatively fringe parts of the party, and Biden putting out this op-ed completely mainstreams it. Vice President Harris, of course, also supports the reforms. She's completely on board with them. So it's nice to see this becoming a really mainstream part of the Democratic agenda.
Absolutely.
And this is how you get it on the path to maybe happening in 5 years or 10 years.
And what's interesting is, and I also want to bring it from this perspective, for a long time, the Democrats were very in favor of the court. During the Warren Court, which is like the most liberal court America's ever had through the 50s and the 60s, a lot of amazing things were passed. The right to having a lawyer, the Brown v. Board of Education, all these different pieces of American civil rights law were done through the court system. And at the time, the Democrats and the liberals were very pro the court. But now, as we've seen the liberal power decline, now liberals are turning against the court. Now, what I want to talk about here is, does this mean that liberals are hypocrites that don't have strong beliefs? No. What this means is political parties act in their own best interest. And it just so happens that in this case, the Democratic Party aligns with a good and reasonable reform. And so what I think has the opportunity to happen over the next decade is if the liberals take back the court, I think Republicans could then eventually get on this. Because then when it's not in the Republicans' best interest to uphold the court, they too will come around.
So the question is whether the liberals will continue to back this policy once they're in power on the court.
That is going to be the job of us and other grassroots liberals who believe in this better court system.
Regardless of the power balance.
Regardless of the power balance, we need to push that as hard as we can, even when we're not in power. And so this is another thing. This goes along with the Electoral College, too. The only thing stopping us from abolishing the Electoral College is it being favorable for Republicans. When the day comes, which it may one day, that a Democrat wins the Electoral College but not the popular vote, the Electoral College will be gone in 3 years.
You think so?
Guaranteed. I think Republicans will, the second the Electoral College doesn't benefit Republicans, they will want to abandon it. And I think the same thing will happen for the court.
But you think the Democrats will still
That's the
hold
thing.
true?
Will
That's what I'm skeptical of.
Yes, and that it could, because I say political parties act in their best interest, it makes it harder. But all it will take grassroots activists to stop that from being the case.